A billionaire CEO believes he can erase his pregnant wife with a single violent shove, claiming her company and her future in one brutal night. But the woman he left bleeding in that alley will return, not as the broken victim he imagined, but as the force that will destroy everything he stole. This is a story of betrayal carved in blood and rain, and justice delivered in a boardroom where power changes hands with the stroke of a pen. A rainy night, an alley that should have been safe. Helen Holt stumbles through the narrow passage between brick buildings, one hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly, the other reaching out to steady herself against the wet wall. The rain falls in sheets, soaking through her elegant dress, the one Tim had chosen for her that morning, saying she looked perfect. Behind her, footsteps echo with measured confidence. "Helen, darling, just a bit further," Tim Jackson calls out, his voice carrying that smooth charm that once made her feel cherished. Now, in this darkening alley, it sounds hollow. Wrong. She turns, confused, rain streaming down her face. "Tim, the car is back that way." "Why?" His expression shifts. The mask of affection drops away like a curtain falling, revealing something cold and cruel beneath. He moves closer, blocking her path back to the street, to the light, to safety. "This is where it ends, Helen." Her breath catches. "What are you talking about?" Tim's laugh is soft, almost casual, as rain drips from his expensive suit. "You've become a burden. The company you so foolishly signed over to me, it's finally worth something. But you," he shakes his head slowly. "You and that child, you're nothing but dead weight now. An inconvenience I no longer need." Horror floods through her. "Tim, please, our baby. Not my problem anymore." He moves with sudden violence, shoving her hard. Helen crashes to the wet pavement, the impact stealing her breath. Pain explodes through her body as she hits the ground, instinctively curling around her unborn child. "You are nothing, Helen. You are weak. You always were." Tim's footsteps fade, leaving only the sound of rain and her ragged breathing. Lying there in the darkness, bleeding and broken, Helen presses her hand against her stomach and makes a promise her husband will soon learn was his greatest mistake. "We're going to survive this, little one. And when we do, everything he took from us, we're taking back." Thunder rolls overhead as consciousness begins to slip away, but in that moment, something fundamental shifts inside Helen Holt. The woman who trusted too easily is dying in this alley. The woman who will rise from it will be something far more dangerous. 6 months earlier, Helen had stood in the sunlit nursery of their estate, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, the other trailing along the white crib Tim had insisted on ordering from Italy. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, manicured gardens stretched toward a horizon that seemed to promise everything she'd ever wanted. "What do you think?" Tim had asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Perfect, isn't it? Perfect." That word followed her everywhere in those days, like a golden thread weaving through the fabric of her new life. The perfect house with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The perfect husband with his tailored suits and easy smile. The perfect future they were building together, one carefully curated moment at a time. She'd met Tim at a charity gala 18 months ago, back when she was still Helen Carter, owner of Carter Design Studio. Her firm had been thriving. Boutique contracts with high-end clients, a growing reputation, the satisfaction of building something entirely her own. She'd arrived at that gala tired but proud, wearing a dress she'd designed herself. Tim had found her by the champagne fountain, all confidence and charm. "You look like someone who doesn't belong at these stuffy events," he'd said, and somehow made it sound like the highest compliment. The courtship had been a whirlwind. Expensive dinners where he listened intently to her talk about textile patterns and spatial design. Weekend trips to his lake house where he'd cook breakfast and call her beautiful without makeup. Flowers delivered to her office with notes that said things like, "Thinking of you," and "You inspire me." 3 months in, he proposed on a private beach at sunset. "Marry me, Helen. Let me give you the world." She'd said yes without hesitation, swept up in the fairy tale of it all. The first shift came subtly. After the engagement, Tim had started mentioning how stressful her work seemed. "You're always exhausted, darling. Is it really worth it?" He'd stroke her hair while saying it, his voice full of concern. "When we're married, you won't need to work so hard. I could take care of everything." Then came the pregnancy, unplanned but welcomed. Tim had been overjoyed, but his suggestions had grown more insistent. Running a company while pregnant? Helen, think about the baby. Think about your health. The partners at her firm had been understanding when she'd announced she needed to step back temporarily. But Tim had pushed further. "Why not sell it? The stress isn't good for you. Trust me, I know business. This is the smart move. Trust me." Those two words became a refrain, a lullaby that lulled her into compliance. She'd signed the papers transferring ownership of Carter Design Studio during her second trimester, sitting in Tim's lawyer's office while he held her hand and promised her it was all for the best. "This way you can focus on being a mother. On us. Forever, Helen. That's what matters. Forever." Another promise that sounded so beautiful in the moment. Looking back now, lying in that alley with rain washing away her blood, Helen could see the signs she'd ignored. The way Tim had gradually moved her away from her old friends, claiming they didn't understand their lifestyle. How he'd taken control of their joint accounts, insisting he was better with finances. The subtle criticisms wrapped in concern. "That dress makes you look tired. Maybe don't mention your old company at dinner. People might think you're dwelling on the past." She'd mistaken his cage for a castle, each golden bar presented as a gift. The sprawling estate wasn't a home, it was isolation. The nursery they'd planned together wasn't about their child. It was about binding her more tightly to him. Every "trust me" had been a lock turning. Every "forever" had been a lie. The woman who'd built a successful design firm from nothing had somehow let herself be reduced to nothing more than an ornament in someone else's carefully constructed life. But that woman was gone now, bleeding out in the rain. The one who would survive would remember everything. Chapter 2. The afternoon light filtered through the study's mahogany doors as Helen made her way down the hallway, carrying a cup of tea she'd made for Tim. He'd been locked away in his office for hours, and despite everything, despite the growing distance between them, despite the way he looked through her lately rather than at her, she still tried to play the role of devoted wife. She was 3 steps from the door when she heard his voice, low and muffled but unmistakable. She paused, hand raised to knock, then froze at the tone. It wasn't the voice he used with her, soft and patronizing. This was different, sharp, amused, alive in a way he never seemed around her anymore. "Next week. Yes, I'm certain." A pause, then a laugh that made her skin prickle. "She won't see it coming. She never does." Helen's hand lowered slowly, the teacup trembling slightly on its saucer. She shouldn't listen. She knew she shouldn't. But something in that laugh, something cruel and satisfied, kept her feet planted exactly where they were. "The lawyers have everything ready. Once she signs the transfer documents, the shares move to me automatically. Clean, legal, irreversible." His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "And then, darling, she'll simply disappear. An accident. A tragedy. You know how dangerous pregnancy can be." The teacup slipped from Helen's fingers. She caught it at the last second, but tea sloshed over the rim, scalding her hand. She barely felt it. "The fool actually signed over her entire company to me last year. Can you imagine? All I had to do was feed her some lines about stress and the baby's health, and she handed me everything she'd built." Another laugh, this one edged with contempt. "After she's gone, I'll have complete control. Her shares, her former company's assets, everything. And you and I can finally stop sneaking around." A woman's voice murmured something Helen couldn't make out. "Of course I'll miss the estate," Tim continued. "But think bigger. With her inheritance and life insurance, we're talking about 50 million minimum. We could buy 10 estates. We can buy whatever we want. She's worth more to me dead than she ever was alive. Though admittedly, that's not saying much." Helen's back hit the wall behind her. The hallway seemed to tilt, the elegant paintings and expensive furnishings blurring at the edges of her vision. Every kind word, every gentle touch, every promise of forever, it had all been theater. A performance designed to strip her of everything while making her believe she was cherished. The cage hadn't been built from gold. It had been built from lies, each one carefully placed to trap her until she had nothing left to lose except her life. And now he was planning to take that too. Her free hand moved automatically to her stomach, to the child growing inside her. The child Tim had called a burden just moments ago. The child he'd referred to as inconvenient dead weight when he thought she couldn't hear. Something cold and clear settled over Helen's shock. Her hand was still shaking, but her mind was suddenly perfectly focused. She set the teacup down silently on the hall table and pulled her phone from her pocket. The recording app opened with a single tap. She pressed her phone against the door, careful to keep it steady, and hit record. "The transfer is scheduled for Friday," Tim was saying. "She'll sign without question. She always does what I tell her. Then Sunday, we take that little drive I mentioned. The cliff road by the coast. Tragic accident. Investigators will find exactly what I need them to find." "And the baby?" the woman asked. "Collateral damage." Tim's voice was utterly flat. "I never wanted it anyway." Helen knew that, even if she pretended otherwise. The child was her desperate attempt to keep me interested. It failed. Helen's finger pressed harder on the phone, making sure every word was captured, every casual dismissal of her life, every calculated step of his plan, every piece of evidence she would need. She recorded for 3 more minutes, until Tim's conversation shifted to logistics she already understood. Then she stopped the recording, saved it to 3 separate cloud accounts, and walked silently back down the hallway on legs that somehow still worked despite the trembling. The woman who trusted Tim Jackson had died in that moment outside his office. The woman who walked away was already planning her survival. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Friday came exactly as Tim had planned it. Helen signed the transfer documents in his lawyer's office that morning, her hand steady despite knowing every word was a trap. She played her part perfectly. The trusting wife, the naive fool who believed her husband when he said it was just a formality and for tax purposes. The lawyer had barely looked at her as she signed away the last piece of leverage she had. Tim had smiled then, that warm smile she'd once found so reassuring. There, all done. Was that so difficult? He'd kissed her forehead like she was a child who'd completed a simple task. That evening, he'd surprised her by suggesting dinner. "Let's celebrate," he'd said, helping her into her coat with unusual attentiveness. "You look beautiful tonight, Helen. That blue dress, it's perfect." Perfect. The word tasted like poison now. They'd taken his car into the city, Tim's hand resting on her knee as he drove, talking about nursery colors and baby names as if he hadn't spent the week planning her murder. Helen responded when expected, laughed at his jokes, let him believe the performance was still working. She had her phone in her purse, recording everything, though she doubted she'd need more evidence than what she already had. The restaurant was in the theater district, upscale and discreet. Tim ordered wine for himself, sparkling water for her. He was charming throughout dinner, the version of himself he'd used to win her in the first place. Other diners glanced at them occasionally. The handsome couple, the pregnant wife glowing in the candlelight, the attentive husband refilling her glass. No one would remember anything unusual. That was the point. After dinner, Tim guided her out onto the sidewalk, his hand firm on her lower back. The street was busy with evening foot traffic, people heading to shows or late dinners. Safe, public, normal. "The car's just down here," Tim said, steering her right instead of left. Helen felt her pulse quicken. "I thought we parked the other direction." "Construction. They've blocked off the street. Easier to go around this way." His voice was smooth, unconcerned. His hand pressed more firmly against her back, not letting her pause or reconsider. They turned down a side street, quieter now, the theater crowds fading behind them. Then another turn. The buildings grew closer together, the streetlights farther apart. Rain had started to fall, light at first, then heavier. "Tim, where are we?" "Just through here." He guided her into a narrow alley between 2 buildings, the kind of place that looked like it should be empty even in daylight. Now, as evening settled into night, it was all shadows and wet brick. Helen's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. This isn't right. The car isn't. Tim's grip on her arm tightened. pulling her deeper into the alley. When she tried to turn back, he blocked her path, and suddenly his face was different. The charm had vanished completely, stripped away to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. This is where it ends, Helen. Her heart slammed against her ribs. What are you talking about? Don't play stupid. It doesn't suit you. He stepped closer, backing her against the wet brick wall. You become a burden. Actually, you've always been a burden. I just had uses for you before. But now? He shook his head slowly. The company you so foolishly gave me is finally generating real profit. Your shares are mine as of this morning. Your life insurance will pay out handsomely. And honestly, watching you waddle around playing house has become unbearable. Tim, please. Her voice broke. Our baby. Not my problem. His voice was flat, matter of fact. You and that child? You're nothing but dead weight now. An inconvenience I no longer need to tolerate. He moved with sudden, brutal efficiency. His hands hit her shoulders hard, shoving her backward. Helen's feet slipped on the wet pavement, and she crashed down, the impact stealing her breath. Pain exploded through her body, her hip, her back, her stomach. She curled instinctively around her unborn child, gasping. Tim stood over her for a moment, rain dripping from his perfectly styled hair. You are nothing, Helen. You are weak. You always were. He adjusted his watch, his suit jacket, composing himself as casually as if he'd just finished a business meeting. You're on your own now. His footsteps echoed as he walked away, measured and unhurried. He didn't look back once. Helen lay there in the darkness, bleeding and broken, listening to those footsteps fade until there was nothing but rain and her own ragged breathing and the terrible understanding that her husband had just tried to murder her. The rain fell harder now, each drop hitting Helen's skin like a small, cold accusation. She lay on the filthy pavement, her expensive blue dress, the one Tim had called perfect, soaking through, clinging to her body. Pain radiated from everywhere. Her hip where she'd hit the ground, her back, her head. But worst of all was the cramping in her abdomen, sharp and terrifying, each wave making her curl tighter around the life inside her. No, 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 she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Her hands pressed against her stomach, feeling for movement, for any sign that her baby was still okay. Please, little one, please hold on. Blood mixed with rainwater beneath her, dark and frightening in the dim light from the distant street. She tried to move, to push herself up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Every attempt sent fresh agony through her core, and she collapsed back down with a sob that tore from her throat. This was how Tim had planned it. Alone, bleeding, dying in an alley where no one would think to look for her until it was far too late. We're going to survive this, she said through gritted teeth, forcing the words out like a vow. Do you hear me, little one? We're going to survive. I'm not giving him this. I'm not giving him the satisfaction. But her vision was starting to blur at the edges. The cold was seeping deeper, and the pain was becoming almost abstract, something happening to someone else. Her phone was still in her purse, but her arms felt too heavy to reach for it. The alley spun slowly around her. She thought about her design studio, the one she'd built with her own hands and given away so easily. She thought about every time she'd ignored her instincts, every red flag she dismissed as paranoia or insecurity. She thought about the nursery with its Italian crib, empty and waiting for a child Tim had never wanted. I'm sorry, she whispered to her baby. I'm so sorry I trusted him. I'm sorry I... Footsteps. Helen's eyes snapped open. Terror surged through her exhausted body. Had Tim come back? Was he making sure she was dead? Jesus Christ. The voice was male but different, younger, urgent, shocked. Hey, can you hear me? A figure appeared above her, backlit by the distant streetlight. Not Tim, someone in a dark jacket, kneeling beside her. Hands touched her shoulder, her neck, checking her pulse. I'm a paramedic, the voice said, calm and professional despite the urgency. My name is Daniel. I've got you. Can you tell me your name? Helen, she managed, her voice cracking. My baby, please. How far along are you? 7 months. The pain, I'm bleeding. Daniel was already pulling out his phone, his other hand pressing gently against her abdomen, assessing. I need an ambulance at the alley behind the Majestic Theater, West entrance. Female, late 20s, approximately 7 months pregnant, significant trauma, active bleeding, possible placental abruption. He paused, listening, his fingers finding her pulse. Pulse is weak and rapid. She's going into shock. We need that bus here now. He stripped off his jacket and draped it over her, then pulled a small emergency kit from his bag. Helen, I need you to stay with me, okay? Keep your eyes open. Can you do that? She tried to nod, but the movement made the world tilt dangerously. What happened? Daniel asked, his hands working efficiently, checking her pupils, pressing carefully along her abdomen, assessing the bleeding. Did someone do this to you? My husband. The words came out broken, mixed with a sob. He pushed me. He left me here. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady, anchoring. Okay, Helen, I've got you now. You're not alone anymore. The ambulance is 2 minutes out. I need you to keep breathing, keep talking to me. Tell me about your baby. Have you picked a name? The question was so unexpected, so normal, that it cut through her panic. Not yet. He said we had time. You'll have time, Daniel said firmly. You're going to have all the time you need. Your baby's heart rate is strong. I can feel it. That's a fighter you've got in there. Helen's hands found his, gripping desperately. Promise me. Promise you won't let my baby die. I promise I'm going to do everything in my power. His eyes met hers, steady and honest. But I need you to fight too, Helen. Whatever happened, whatever brought you here, you survived it so far. Keep surviving. Your baby needs you to keep fighting. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. That's our ride, Daniel said. 2 minutes, Helen. Just 2 more minutes, and we'll have you in the ambulance. Stay with me. Tell me what you do for a living. I had a design studio. Her voice was fading, but she clung to his words, using them as a lifeline. Carter Design. I gave it up. Why? Because he asked me to. The truth of it was bitter. Because I was stupid enough to trust him. No. Daniel's voice was sharp, cutting through her drifting consciousness. You weren't stupid. You were human. But Helen, listen to me. Survival isn't weakness. You're lying here in the rain, bleeding, and you're still fighting. That's not stupid. That's strength. The ambulance pulled up at the mouth of the alley, lights blazing red and white against the wet brick. Paramedics jumped out, rushing toward them with a stretcher and equipment. We've got severe trauma, possible placental abruption, Daniel called out to his colleagues. Let's move. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Helen kept her eyes locked on Daniel's face, using it as an anchor against the pain and fear threatening to pull her under. Stay with us, Helen, he said, his hand gripping hers as they rushed her toward the ambulance. You're going to make it. Both of you. She wanted to believe him. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle lurched into motion, sirens screaming, Helen held onto those words like a promise. Tim had left her for dead, but she wasn't dead yet. Helen woke to the steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell of hospital air. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why everything hurt. Then it all came rushing back. The alley, the rain, Tim's cold eyes as he pushed her down, the paramedic's voice anchoring her to life. Her hands flew to her stomach. Your baby's okay. A nurse appeared beside her bed, gentle and efficient. Heart rate is strong. You're both stable. The relief hit so hard that Helen started crying, great shaking sobs that made her ribs ache. The nurse handed her tissues and adjusted her fore without judgment, as if pregnant women broke down in her care every day. Maybe they did. You've been out for about 18 hours, the nurse continued. You have a concussion, bruised ribs, and some internal bruising, but the baby is resilient. The doctor will be in soon to go over everything. Helen nodded, not trusting her voice. 18 hours. Tim probably thought she was dead by now. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it brought a strange clarity. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd gotten away with it. He had no idea what was coming. The first day blurred together, doctors checking her vitals, running tests, asking careful questions about how she'd ended up in that alley. Helen gave vague answers about an accident, a fall. She saw the disbelief in their eyes, the way they exchanged glances that said they knew she was lying, but no one pushed. Not yet. Daniel came by that afternoon, still in his paramedic uniform, carrying a small potted plant. "Thought you might want something living in here besides hospital food," he said, setting it on the windowsill. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." Helen tried to smile, but it came out wrong. "Thank you for finding me." For her voice broke. "For everything. Just doing my job." But the way he said it, the quiet sincerity, told her it was more than that. He visited again the next day, and the day after that. Short visits, never intrusive, always bringing something small, a book, a decent cup of coffee, once a sketch pad when he'd learned about her design background. "I can't draw to save my life," he'd said, "but I thought you might want to." Helen had stared at the blank pages for a long time before she could bring herself to pick up the pencil. When she finally did, her hand shook so badly the lines came out jagged and wrong. She'd thrown the pencil across the room in frustration, and Daniel had simply picked it up and set it back on her table without comment. It was different from anything Tim had ever done. Tim's gifts had always come with expectations attached, invisible strings that bound her more tightly to his vision of who she should be. Daniel's kindness asked for nothing in return. On the fourth day, Helen finally broke down. Daniel had brought her actual food from a deli, soup that didn't taste like cardboard, and she'd taken one bite before the tears started. "He tried to kill me," she said, the words tumbling out. "My husband. He pushed me into that alley and left me to die. He planned it. All of it." Daniel set down his coffee slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Does anyone else know?" "No." Helen wiped at her face with the back of her hand. "Everyone thinks I had an accident. But I heard him. I recorded him talking about it, planning my murder like it was just another business deal." "Do you still have a recording?" "On my phone. In my purse." She gestured to the small closet where her belongings were stored. 3 backup copies in the cloud. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." The admission felt like failure. "He has everything now. My company, my money, the shares I signed over. I have nothing except evidence of what he tried to do, and even that." She shook her head. "He's powerful, connected. His lawyers would bury me." "Maybe." Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Or maybe you're thinking about this wrong." "What do you mean?" "Right now, he thinks you're dead. Or dying. Either way, he thinks he's won." Daniel's eyes were steady on hers. "That's leverage, Helen. That's time to plan, to prepare, to build a case he won't see coming until it's too late." Helen stared at him, something stirring in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something harder, colder. "You think I should let him believe I'm dead? I think you should consider every option you have." He paused. "I also think you're stronger than you realize. You survived what he did to you. You protected your baby through trauma that would have broken most people. That's not weakness, Helen. That's proof of strength." The words hit differently than they had in the alley. Then, she'd been fighting just to stay conscious. Now, in the sterile safety of the hospital room, they sank deeper. Tim had spent months convincing her she was weak, helpless, incapable of functioning without him. Even now, part of her believed it. But that part was wrong. "My whole life with him was a lie," she said quietly. "Every kind word, every promise. He built a cage around me, so carefully that I helped him lock the doors. So build your way out." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "You're an architect, aren't you? A designer? You know how to build things. Build your case. Build your defense. Build a new life that he can't touch." Helen looked down at her hands, at the 4-line and the bruises still fading on her wrists. She thought about the recording on her phone, about the shares she'd sign away, about the company she'd given up. She thought about the nursery in Tim's estate, waiting for a baby he'd never wanted. "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you do." Daniel stood, preparing to leave for his shift. "You know exactly what you're capable of. You just spent so long listening to someone tell you you're weak that you started believing it." "But Helen," he paused at the door, "survival is not weakness. It is proof of strength. Remember that." After he left, Helen sat in the quiet of her hospital room, feeling something shift inside her. The woman who trusted Tim Jackson, who'd signed away her company and her independence, who'd made herself small to fit into his perfect vision. That woman was gone. She died in that alley, just like Tim intended. But the woman who'd survived? She was capable of things Tim had never imagined. Helen reached for her phone and opened the recording app. Tim's voice filled the room, cold and calculating. She'll sign without question. She always does what I tell her. Not anymore. She saved 3 more backup copies to different cloud services, then began making a list. Everything she'd need. Everyone she'd have to contact. Every piece of evidence that would prove not just what Tim had done in that alley, but everything that led up to it. Tim thought he'd won by leaving her bleeding in the rain. He had no idea the fight was just beginning. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnet 4.5. By the end of the first week, Helen's hospital room had transformed into something that looked less like a recovery ward and more like a command center. Her laptop sat open on the rolling table, surrounded by notepads covered in her precise handwriting. The sketch pad Daniel had brought her now contained diagrams instead of drawings, timelines, organizational charts, lists of evidence cross-referenced with dates and witnesses. She'd requested her medical files be sealed for privacy. The hospital administrator had raised an eyebrow, but complied. As far as most of the world knew, Helen Holt had disappeared after dinner with her husband 6 days ago. Tim would have reported her missing by now, playing the concerned spouse perfectly. The thought made her jaw tighten. "You're sure about this?" Daniel asked, leaning against the windowsill during his lunch break. He'd been bringing her information, discreetly, carefully. News reports, social media posts, anything that showed what Tim was doing in her absence. Helen pulled up a video on her laptop and turned it toward him. Tim's face filled the screen, haggard and worried, standing outside their estate surrounded by reporters. "Please, if anyone has seen my wife, if anyone knows anything." His voice broke convincingly. "Helen is 7 months pregnant. She needs medical attention. I just want her home safe." Daniel's expression darkened. "He's good. He's had practice." Helen closed the laptop with more force than necessary. "He's been performing our entire marriage. This is just another role." She pulled up a spreadsheet she'd been building, color-coded and meticulous. "Look at this. 3 days after I disappeared, supposedly disappeared, he moved $50,000 from our joint account into an offshore account I didn't know existed. Yesterday, he filed preliminary paperwork to have me declared legally dead. You can't do that for 7 years normally, but with the right lawyers and the right circumstances. He's not even waiting to see if you turn up. Why would he? He knows exactly where he left me." Helen's hands curled into fists. "He's already planning his next move. Grieving widower, tragic loss, poor baby that didn't survive. 6 months from now, he'll be seen with his mistress publicly. A year from now, they'll be married. And he'll have everything. My company, my shares, my life insurance, my reputation. Not if we stop him. We—" Helen looked up sharply. Daniel pushed off from the windowsill. "I told you, survival is proof of strength. But even the strongest people need allies." He checked his watch. "I have someone I want you to meet. She's outside. Are you up for visitors?" Helen straightened despite the persistent ache in her ribs. "Send her in." The woman who entered 5 minutes later was in her mid-50s, wearing a sharp gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase that had seen years of courtroom battles. She had the kind of face that could smile warmly or cut through lies with equal efficiency. "Helen Holt." She extended her hand. "I'm Margaret Chun. Daniel tells me you need a lawyer who specializes in going after powerful men who think they're untouchable." Helen shook her hand, feeling the firm, professional grip. "That's exactly what I need." Margaret settled into the chair beside the bed, pulled out a legal pad, and got straight to business. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." So Helen did. She walked Margaret through the whirlwind courtship, the gradual isolation, the way Tim had convinced her to sign over her company. She explained the overheard phone call, the recording she'd made, the dinner that ended in the alley. She showed Margaret the bruises still fading on her arms, the medical reports documenting her injuries. When she finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her pen tapping against her notepad. "You have him," she said finally. The recording alone is damning. Add in the medical evidence, the financial documents showing his pattern of control, the timeline of events. Helen, this is the kind of case prosecutors dream about. But you're right that he's powerful and connected. A direct criminal case could take years, and his lawyers would drag you through hell. They question your mental state, suggest you misinterpreted what you heard, paint you as an unstable pregnant woman who had an accident and is now making accusations. Margaret leaned forward. We need to hit him where he can't defend himself. Publicly, definitively, in a way that strips him of everything before he has time to maneuver. Helen felt something cold and determined settle in her chest. I'm listening. Margaret flipped to a fresh page. Right now, he thinks you're dead. That gives us the greatest advantage we could ask for. He's already making moves, showing his hand. Let him keep doing that. Let him consolidate what he thinks he's won. While we build the case. While we build an airtight trap. Margaret's eyes gleamed. Daniel mentioned you signed over shares in the company last week. Do you remember the exact terms? Helen pulled up the documents on her laptop. She downloaded everything from the lawyer's secure portal before leaving for dinner that night. Transfer of 51% ownership, effective immediately upon my signature. Margaret studied the screen. But you're not dead. You're the majority shareholder of a company your husband is currently operating under the assumption that he controls. He has my shares. He has shares you signed over under duress, which we can prove. Margaret made notes rapidly. More importantly, you're listed as a board member. You have voting rights, access rights, and right now, no one knows you're alive to exercise them. Helen's mind began racing ahead, seeing the shape of what Margaret was suggesting. You want me to come back from the dead. I want you to come back with undeniable authority. Margaret looked up, her expression fierce. We spent the next 2 weeks gathering every piece of evidence we can find. Financial records, communications, witness statements from people who saw him isolating you. We document his actions since your disappearance. Every suspicious transfer, every premature legal filing. Then we wait for the perfect moment. What moment? He'll call a board meeting. He has to officially consolidate control now that the mandatory waiting period for your share transfer has passed. He'll present himself as the grieving husband stepping up to save the company his poor, missing wife built. Margaret smiled, and it wasn't kind. That's when you walk in. Alive. Documented. With a lawyer, evidence of attempted murder, and a claim to controlling interest in the company he thinks he owns. Daniel, who'd been listening quietly, let out a low whistle. That's brutal. That's justice. Helen felt something fierce and hot burning in her chest. For weeks, she'd been the victim in Tim's story. The weak wife, the burden, the inconvenience to be eliminated. He gets up in front of the board, the press, everyone, and I take it all back. The company, the shares, the narrative. Exactly. Margaret pulled out contracts from her briefcase. But we have to do this right. Every I dotted, every T crossed. His lawyers will come after us with everything they have. We need to be bulletproof. Over the next hour, they laid it out. Margaret would quietly file for an emergency stay on any attempts to declare Helen legally dead. She'd subpoena financial records, tracing every dollar Tim had moved. Daniel would help gather medical evidence, documenting not just Helen's physical injuries, but the psychological abuse that had led to her isolation. Helen would do what she did best, design. She'd map out every connection, every piece of leverage, every weak point in Tim's carefully constructed empire. She'd spent 2 years watching him operate, learning his patterns, understanding his strategies. Now she'd use all of it against him. One more thing, Margaret said as she prepared to leave. You need to decide how public you want this to be. We can keep it contained to the boardroom, handle it as a private corporate matter. Or, she paused, we can make sure the whole world sees what he did. Helen thought about the video of Tim playing the concerned husband. She thought about his mistress, waiting in the wings for her tragic inheritance. She thought about every woman who might trust Tim Jackson in the future, who might sign over their company or their independence because he smiled and said, "Trust me." Make it public, she said. I want everyone to see exactly who he is. Margaret's smile was sharp and approving. I was hoping you'd say that. After Margaret left, Daniel stayed behind, helping Helen organize the documents they discussed. "You know this is going to be hard," he said quietly. "Even with all the evidence, even with Margaret, going up against someone like Tim." "I know." Helen looked at the photo on her laptop screen. The sprawling estate, the nursery she'd never bring her baby to, the life that had been built on lies. "But staying dead is harder. Letting him win is harder. Raising my child knowing I was too afraid to fight back." She shook her head. "That's not the person I want to be." "Good." Daniel headed for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you're going to destroy him." Helen turned back to her laptop, pulling up the recording of Tim's voice discussing her murder like a business transaction. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." The war room was ready. The evidence was damning. The plan was set. Now all she had to do was rise from the dead and take back everything Tim Jackson thought he'd stolen. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Tim Jackson sat at the head of the polished mahogany table in the executive boardroom of Jackson Holdings, feeling more powerful than he had in months. The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in a golden light that felt appropriate for what was about to be his greatest triumph. Around the table sat 12 board members, old money, new money, venture capitalists who'd backed his aggressive expansion over the past 3 years. They'd all come when he called, dropping other meetings and obligations because Tim Jackson didn't summon people unless it was important. Today was very important indeed. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Tim began, his voice carrying just the right note of gravitas mixed with controlled emotion. He'd practiced this speech in the mirror that morning, perfecting every pause, every catch in his voice. "I know the past 2 weeks have been difficult. The uncertainty surrounding Helen's disappearance has weighed heavily on all of us." Several board members nodded sympathetically. Victoria Ashford, the silver-haired CFO who'd served under Helen when she still ran Carter Design, looked particularly somber. "The police continue their investigation, of course," Tim continued. "But I think we all know," he paused, letting his voice break slightly. "The chances of finding her alive at this point are minimal. 7 months pregnant, missing for over 2 weeks with no contact, no activity on her accounts." He shook his head, the picture of a man barely holding himself together. Richard Chun, one of the newer board members and no relation to Margaret, leaned forward. "Tim, we're all deeply sorry, but you mentioned this meeting was urgent." "It is." Tim straightened, transitioning smoothly from grieving husband to decisive CEO. "While Helen's fate remains uncertain legally, the company cannot remain in limbo. We have major contracts pending, expansion plans that need approval, investors who need confidence that Jackson Holdings has stable leadership." He pulled up a presentation on the massive screen behind him. Charts, projections, growth metrics that painted a picture of a company poised for explosive success. Before her disappearance, Helen signed over her controlling shares to me. That transfer became official last week. He clicked to the next slide, showing the share distribution. "As of today, I hold 51% ownership of this company. But more than that, I hold the vision that will take us to the next level." Victoria shifted in her seat, and Tim caught the movement. She'd been loyal to Helen, had worked with her for years before the acquisition. She'd been the only board member to question whether Helen's sudden retreat from company leadership was really what she wanted. But Victoria hadn't questioned hard enough to stop it, and now it was too late. "The past 6 months have been challenging," Tim continued. "Helen's pregnancy complications, her need to step back from daily operations, the uncertainty it created. These have been distractions we could ill afford in such a competitive market." "Distractions?" Victoria's voice was sharp. "Tim, she's your wife. She built this company from, and I have nothing but respect for what Helen accomplished," Tim interrupted smoothly. "But respect doesn't change market realities. The numbers don't lie." He gestured to the screen. "Since I took over operational control, revenue is up 18%. Client retention has improved. We've landed 3 major contracts that Helen's more conservative approach would never have pursued." He let that sink in, watching several board members nod approvingly. They were business people first. Sentiment was nice, but results were what mattered. "What I'm proposing today Tim said, moving to stand behind his chair, hands resting on the leather back, is that we make my leadership official and permanent. Vote to consolidate control, eliminate the ambiguity, and move forward with the aggressive expansion strategy I've outlined. No more distractions. No more uncertainty. Just clear direction and decisive action. You want us to vote while your wife is still missing? Victoria's voice rose. While there's still a chance. There is no chance, Victoria. Tim's voice hardened just slightly, enough to remind everyone who held the power in this room. And even if by some miracle Helen were found alive, she signed over majority control willingly. That doesn't change. What I'm asking for is your confidence and your vote to move forward without the constant questions about leadership succession. James Morrison, the corporate attorney who sat on the board, cleared his throat. The legalities are sound. Helen's share transfer was properly executed. Tim has majority ownership. While the optics of voting during an active missing persons investigation might be complicated, there's no legal barrier to consolidating his control. Tim smiled internally. Morrison had been expensive, but worth every penny. The man understood that law was just another tool for those who knew how to use it. I'm not asking you to forget Helen, Tim said, softening his voice again, playing the balance perfectly. I'm asking you to honor what she built by ensuring this company survives and thrives. That's what she would have wanted. That's what she told me she wanted the night he paused, as if the memory was too painful. The night I last saw her. Several board members looked moved. Even Victoria seemed to waver slightly. Tim had them. So let's vote, he said, straightening his tie. Let's solidify our control, eliminate the distractions, and build the future this company deserves. All in favor. The boardroom doors opened. Tim turned, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. His assistant knew better than to disturb an executive meeting. He was already forming a reprimand when he saw who was walking through those doors. Every word died in his throat. Helen stood in the doorway, very much alive, dressed in a sharp black suit that hung slightly loose on her frame, but somehow made her look more formidable rather than less. Her hand rested on her stomach, on the child he'd left her bleeding for. Her eyes, when they met his, were cold and absolutely steady. Behind her stood a woman in a gray suit carrying a briefcase, and behind them both, a security guard. The color drained from Tim's face so quickly that Richard Chin half rose from his chair in concern. I'm sorry I'm late, Helen said, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden, shocked silence. Traffic was terrible, but I wouldn't have missed this meeting for anything. She walked toward the table with measured steps, and Tim watched her approach like a man watching his own execution. Hello, Tim, she said softly. Did you miss me? Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnet 4.5. The silence in the boardroom stretched for 3 heartbeats. Tim stood frozen behind his chair, his knuckles white against the leather, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to mask shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally, raw fear. Helen. Her name came out strangled. You're how? Alive. Helen finished for him, taking another step toward the table. Yes, Tim. Very much alive. Though I understand that comes as a disappointment. Victoria Ashford was the first to react, standing so abruptly her chair rolled backward. Helen, my God. Everyone thought, that I was dead. Helen's gaze never left Tim's face. That's certainly what my husband hoped when he left me bleeding in an alley 2 weeks ago. The room erupted. Board members talking over each other, some standing, Richard Chun pulling out his phone. Tim held up his hands, his composure reassembling itself with visible effort. Helen, darling, you're confused. You've been through trauma. Obviously, you've been through something terrible, but whatever you think happened. I don't think, Tim. I know. Helen gestured to Margaret, who'd moved to the side of the room and was calmly setting up a laptop connected to the boardroom's presentation system. And in a moment, everyone in this room will know too. This is absurd. Tim's voice gained strength, shifting into the commanding tone he used to control meetings. You clearly need medical attention. You're not well. James, call security and have them contact a hospital. Security is already here. Helen said, nodding toward the guard who'd entered with her. And there are 3 police detectives waiting in the lobby, but we'll get to them shortly. First, I'd like to introduce everyone to Margaret Chun, my attorney. Margaret gave a professional nod. Good afternoon. What you're about to see is evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation. Ms. Holt has agreed to share it with this board, given the urgent nature of today's meeting and Mr. Jackson's attempts to consolidate control of a company through fraud and attempted murder. That's defamation, Tim snapped, but his voice had lost its authority. Sweat was beginning to show at his temples. Helen, whatever happened to you, I had nothing to do with it. I've been desperate to find you. The police have been very interested in your statements, Margaret interrupted smoothly, particularly the discrepancies between what you told them and what actually happened. She opened a folder, sliding copies across the table to each board member. What you're holding are medical reports from Mercy General Hospital documenting Ms. Holt's injuries, including detailed photographs of bruising consistent with being forcibly pushed, a concussion, internal trauma, and complications requiring immediate intervention to save her pregnancy. Helen watched the board members open their folders, saw the shock registering on their faces as they looked at the photos. Victoria's hand went to her mouth. The night I disappeared, Helen said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. Tim took me to dinner. Afterward, he led me into an alley under false pretenses. And then he told me exactly why. Helen, you're not thinking clearly. Play the recording, Helen said. Margaret clicked a key. Tim's voice filled the boardroom, crisp and clear from the high-quality speakers. Next week. Yes, I'm certain. She won't see it coming. She never does. Tim lunged toward the laptop, but the security guard moved faster, stepping between him and Margaret. Sir, I need you to stay where you are. The recording continued. Every board member sat motionless, listening to Tim discuss Helen's planned disappearance with cold calculation. His cruel laughter when he called her a fool for signing over her company. His casual discussion of her murder as just another business transaction. The lawyers have everything ready. Once she signs the transfer documents, the shares move to me automatically. Clean, legal, irreversible. And then, darling, she'll simply disappear. An accident. A tragedy. You know how dangerous pregnancy can be. Victoria's face had gone pale. James Morrison was writing frantically on his legal pad. Richard Chun stared at Tim with something approaching horror. The recording played through Tim's plans for the Cliff Road, his dismissal of their unborn child as collateral damage, his excitement about the $50 million he'd gained from her death. When it finally ended, the silence was absolute. Tim's face was slick with sweat now, his hands trembling. It's taken out of context. I was discussing a film plot. A book I was. There are 3 more recordings, Margaret said calmly, including one from the alley itself, where Mr. Jackson explicitly told Ms. Holt, and I quote, "You and that child are nothing but dead weight now. Would you like us to play those as well?" You're lying, Tim said desperately, looking around the table at faces that had turned hostile. She's manipulating all of you. I'm the woman you tried to kill. Helen's voice cut through his protests like a blade. The woman you isolated, controlled, and stripped of everything she built. The woman you called weak and stupid and worthless. She took the final steps to the table, placing her hands flat on its polished surface. But here's what you never understood, Tim. I survived, and survival is not weakness. It is proof of strength. She pulled out the chair directly across from his and sat down, holding his gaze. For 2 years, you made me believe I needed you, that I was nothing without you, that every decision I made on my own was wrong. Helen's voice was quiet, but carried to every corner of the room. You took my company and made me thank you for it. You took my independence and called it love. You planned my murder and probably practiced your grief face in the mirror. Tim opened his mouth, but no sound came out. But you made one critical mistake, Helen continued. You underestimated me. You thought I was so broken, so controlled, that I'd walk into that alley without question. And I did. But I also pressed record. I also survived. And I also spent the last 2 weeks building a case that will strip you of everything you stole. She nodded to Margaret, who slid another folder in front of Helen. This one she opened herself. These documents revoke the share transfer on the grounds that it was obtained under duress and as part of a premeditated plan to commit murder. My attorney has already filed them with the court. You don't have 51% of this company, Tim. You never did. That's not legal. Tim turned to James Morrison desperately. Tell her it's not legal. James didn't look up from his notes. Given the evidence of coercion and criminal intent, actually it is. Helen pulled out another set of papers. This is my vote as a board member to remove you from all positions of authority in this company, effective immediately. This, another document, is a restraining order preventing you from accessing company property, accounts, or records. And this, she slid the final paper across the table, is a warrant for your arrest on charges of attempted murder, fraud, coercion, and conspiracy. She stood, placing both hands on the table, leaning forward until she was close enough to see the panic in Tim's eyes. You told me I was nothing, she said softly. You told me I was weak. You told me I'd never survive without you. Her voice hardened. But I'm not nothing, Tim. I'm not your victim. I'm not your wife. As of today, I am your equal. She straightened, and her next words rang with absolute authority. No, as of today, I am your superior. The boardroom doors opened again. 3 detectives entered, badges visible. Timothy Jackson, the lead detective, said, "We need you to come with us." Helen watched as they approached him, as the man who controlled her for 2 years shrank back against his chair, as his perfect composure finally shattered completely. "This isn't over," Tim hissed at her as the detectives reached him. "You think you've won, but my lawyers, my connections, will be very busy," Margaret said pleasantly. "We've already notified the SEC about the suspicious financial transfers, and the press is waiting downstairs. I believe they'll be very interested in this story." Tim's face went white. As the detectives led him toward the door, he turned back one last time, and Helen saw in his eyes what she'd never seen before. Fear. The doors closed behind him. Helen remained standing at the head of the table, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, facing the board members who'd watched her resurrection. "Now," she said calmly, "let's discuss the future of this company. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses." Sonnet 4.5. The boardroom felt different after Tim was gone, as if the air itself had changed. Helen remained standing at the head of the table, aware that 12 pairs of eyes were fixed on her, some sympathetic, some calculating, all reassessing who she was and what she represented. Victoria Ashford broke the silence first. "Helen, her voice cracked. I should have questioned more. When you stepped back, when you signed over the company, I knew something felt wrong, but I convinced myself it was your choice." "It was my choice," Helen said quietly. "Made under coercion, made under false pretenses, but still my choice. I own that. What matters now is what we choose going forward." Richard Chun cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Ms. Holt, this company has been in chaos for weeks. The leadership vacuum, the negative press from your disappearance, now this scandal." He gestured vaguely at the folders still open on the table. "We need stability." "I agree." Helen pulled out the chair Tim had occupied minutes before and sat down deliberately. "Which is why I'm proposing an emergency vote to restore the company's original leadership structure, the one that existed before my husband systematically dismantled it." Margaret placed a new set of documents on the table. "What you're looking at is a motion to invalidate all corporate decisions made by Timothy Jackson during the period in which he obtained control through fraudulent means. That includes the share transfer, his appointment as CEO, and any contracts or agreements signed under his authority." James Morrison flipped through the pages, his lawyer's eyes scanning rapidly. "This is extensive. You're essentially proposing we rewind the company to its state 6 months ago." "Not exactly," Helen said. "I'm proposing we acknowledge that the past 6 months were built on a foundation of lies and criminal activity. Any legitimate business conducted during that time can be ratified retroactively. But Tim's control? That needs to be erased completely. And then what?" This from David Park, a venture capitalist who'd invested heavily during Tim's expansion. "You step back in as CEO, you're 7 months pregnant, you've been hospitalized, You've been through trauma that would break most people. I'm not most people. Helen's voice was steel. And yes, I've been through hell. But I built this company from nothing once before. I can sure as hell save it now. Victoria stood abruptly. I move that we vote immediately to invalidate Timothy Jackson's control and restore Helen Holt to her position as majority shareholder and CEO of this company. Seconded, said Patricia Winters, one of the older board members who'd been silent until now. James Morrison raised a hand. I need to advise that this is highly irregular. Normally we'd have a longer review period, legal consultations. Tim Jackson tried to murder one of our board members to steal her company. Victoria snapped. I think we're beyond normal procedure. Margaret leaned forward. The documents are legally sound. I've spent 2 weeks ensuring every detail would hold up in court. You can vote now or wait for the criminal trial to conclude, but either way, Mr. Jackson's control of this company is finished. Helen watched the board members exchange glances, saw the calculations happening behind their eyes. Some are loyal to her. Some are loyal to profit. Some are simply trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing. All in favor, Victoria said, her voice ringing clear. One by one, hands rose around the table. Patricia, Victoria, 3 others in quick succession. James Morrison hesitated, then raised his hand with a slight nod. Richard Chun was last, but even he finally conceded. Motion carries, Victoria said, and Helen heard the satisfaction in her voice. Welcome back, Helen. Margaret slid the final documents across the polished mahogany. Helen picked up the pen, the same pen Tim had used to start this meeting, planning his coronation, and signed her name in firm, clear strokes across every page. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. When she finished, she looked up at the faces around the table. I know the past few weeks have been difficult. The coming months won't be easy either. There will be press, investigations, trials. But this company survived my absence, and it will survive this scandal. We're going to rebuild, not just the business, but the trust that was broken. She stood, one hand resting on her stomach. I'm going to take the rest of this week to recover and prepare. Board meeting next Monday, 9 a.m. We'll go through every decision Tim made and determine what we keep and what we burn. Bring your questions. Bring your concerns. We'll face them together. As the board members filed out, Victoria lingered. Helen, I really am sorry. I should have. You did what you thought was right at the time. Helen touched her arm gently. So did I. We both learned better. That's what matters. After everyone left, Helen stood alone in the boardroom, looking out at the city skyline. Margaret had gone to coordinate with the police. The building was quiet, the afternoon fading into evening. Her phone buzzed. A text from Daniel saw the news. You did it. How are you feeling? Helen smiled and typed back. Like I just took my life back. She left the boardroom and walked through offices that had been hers, then Tim's, and now were hers again. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. In her old office, the one Tim had claimed, she found photos of herself that he'd left on the desk. Props for his performance as the devoted husband. She swept them into the trash. 3 weeks later, Helen stood in a different nursery. Not the one in Tim's estate with its Italian crib and carefully curated perfection. This was in a modest apartment downtown, close to the office. The walls were painted a soft yellow. The crib was from a regular store, assembled by Daniel on his day off. The mobile hanging above it had been a gift for Victoria. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Helen rested both hands on her stomach, feeling her daughter move. The doctors had confirmed it earlier that week. A girl, healthy and strong despite everything they'd been through. Listen to me, little one, she whispered in the quiet room. I want you to know something important. Our life will not be built on lies. It will be built on truth, on strength, and on love. Real love, not the kind that comes with conditions and cages. The baby kicked, as if in agreement. Your father tried to destroy us, but we survived. We're here, and we're free, and we're going to build something better than anything he could have given us. Helen smiled, feeling tears on her cheeks, but not bothering to wipe them away. You're going to grow up knowing that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up. And we got back up, sweetheart. We rose from that alley, and we took back everything that mattered. Outside, the city lights were coming on, casting the nursery in a warm glow. Helen looked out at the skyline, at the building where her company was recovering and rebuilding under her leadership. Tim was awaiting trial. His mistress had vanished the moment the news broke. His lawyers were scrambling. His empire was crumbling. And Helen Holt was standing in a nursery she'd chosen, in a life she'd reclaimed, holding her daughter and whispering promises she knew she'd keep. "We won, little one," she said softly. "Now let's build something worth winning."